Loud claims, real risk. Russia's rhetoric on territory and nuclear weapons. What it means for Ukraine and the world. In speeches and public statements through 2025, Russian leaders have blended battlefield boasts with stark warnings that echo across capitals in Europe and Washington. The message from Moscow is blunt. Russia says it has won territory this year, asserts broad ambitions over Ukraine, and repeatedly reminds the world that it still possesses powerful nuclear forces. Those statements are designed to shape politics, deter outside support for Kyiv, and raise the cost of deeper Western involvement. But they also risk dangerous miscalculation. What Russia is saying, the public claims. In early October 2025, President Vladimir Putin told senior commanders that Russian forces had captured nearly 5,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory during the year and had taken some 212 localities, arguing Moscow retains the strategic initiative on the battlefield. Putin framed those gains as proof that Russia is pressing forward with the goals it declared at the start of the 2022 invasion. At the same time, Kremlin rhetoric has occasionally moved beyond battlefield statistics into grander political claims. Commentary in pro-Kremlin outlets and some Russian officials have at times portrayed mainland Ukraine as a prospective long-term objective, language that visitors to the region find chilling when paired with military gains. Analysts in Western think tanks have warned that such language reflects an imperial ambition, not merely tactical assertions. Nuclear reminders, deterrence or escalation. Repeatedly since 2022, Moscow has inserted nuclear reminders into public diplomacy. Those reminders have two audiences: domestic audiences at home and foreign governments that might consider expanding their military support for Ukraine. Kremlin spokespeople and senior figures have warned that certain transfers of long-range weapons to Kyiv would cross red lines. The debate intensified in October 2025 when discussions in Washington surfaced about supplying long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles, weapons with very long reach that, in theory, could be adapted for many roles. Russian officials called such transfers dangerous and warned they would have grave consequences for bilateral relations and European security. Security analysts and public reports emphasize that Russia's nuclear threats are a form of political signaling rather than an operational plan to launch strategic nuclear strikes. But they underline how Moscow sees nuclear rhetoric as a deterrent instrument. Western analysts note that Russia has modernized parts of its strategic forces and that frequent public references to nuclear capability increase uncertainty and the risk of misreading intent. What the words do, strategic and diplomatic effects. Moscow's combination of battlefield claims and nuclear reminders performs several functions. Deterrence of escalation. By signaling nuclear resolve when certain weapons might be supplied to Ukraine, Russia attempts to dissuade allies from providing long-range strike capabilities that could reach deep into Russian territory. Domestic legitimization. Victory claims reinforce the Kremlin's narrative of strength and restore political legitimacy at home, especially when paired with state media coverage. Political leverage. Bold statements about ownership of Ukrainian territory and threats that imply catastrophic consequences are intended to shape future negotiations, raising the perceived price of pushing Russia militarily or diplomatically. The reality on the ground limits to the rhetoric. Rhetoric, however, is not the same as reality. Independent military assessments and open-source intelligence indicate that while Russia has made periodic advances and claims of gains, battlefield dynamics remain fluid and contested. Neither side has achieved a decisive war-ending victory. Rather, the conflict is prolonged, bitter, and expensive for both. Think tanks that map the front lines show advances in some areas and stalemates in others, and Ukraine continues to mount counterattacks and long-range strikes of its own. On the nuclear question, most outside experts judge that a Russian decision to use strategic nuclear weapons would be catastrophic and not in Moscow's obvious interest because of the global political, economic, and military consequences. Still, the repeated public reminders complicate calculations. They make some NATO members more cautious about providing certain weapon types and raise the international stakes for every policy decision about Ukraine. Why this matters to the international community. Escalation risk. Nuclear rhetoric increases the fog of strategy. Even if the rhetoric is mostly political signaling, it expands a space for miscalculation. A battlefield surprise, an accident, or a domestic political escalation could produce a crisis that spirals beyond control. Aid and weapons policy. Allies must weigh Kyiv's need for long-range systems for defensive and precision targeting against the risk of prompting harsher Russian responses. Russian threats about specific weapons transfers aim to tilt that balance by raising political costs for suppliers. Diplomatic negotiations. Moscow's public posture signals what it might demand at the negotiating table. Recognition of territorial gains, security guarantees, or the exclusion of certain Western systems. That hard bargaining posture reduces the space for compromise. What Western and Ukrainian planners are doing. Western governments continue to provide military, financial, and humanitarian support to Ukraine while publicly warning against steps that would dangerously escalate the conflict. NATO and allied states have increased conventional deterrence measures in neighboring countries and continue to debate which weapon systems should be supplied to Kiev. Ukraine itself continues to fight on the ground and to demonstrate capabilities, including longer-range strikes into Russian territory, that complicate the picture Moscow is trying to present. Bottom line, threats are real, but so are limits. Russia's public statements, boasting of territorial gains and invoking nuclear capability, are clear attempts to shape the battlefield, deter Western involvement, and enforce political narratives at home and abroad. Those threats are not empty and must be taken seriously. Yet analysts emphasize that rhetoric alone does not equal an operational shift to use nuclear weapons, and the war's outcome will remain dependent on a host of military, economic, and diplomatic facts, not only on the loudest claims broadcast from Moscow. Continued vigilance, calibrated support for Ukraine, and sustained diplomacy are necessary to reduce the risk of miscalculation and to protect civilians caught in the conflict.